This webinar is hosted by Re.Climate, Canada Centre for Climate Communication and Engagement at Carleton University and Echo Analytics Research. Re.Climate is a hub that brings together researchers, experts, strategists, and creative talent to support the work of a diverse network of stakeholders, including government, NGOs, small businesses, civil society, and Indigenous organizations. And the goal of Re.Climate work is to create impact and shift attitudes and behaviors towards climate through the support of its network. Our co-host is Echo Analytics Research, a cooperative project on the shared platform of Makeway, led by 15 environmental NGOs. Echo Analytics publishes a broad range of opinion research and guidance and environmental issues with the aim of strengthening Canada's environmental movement and enriching the public discourse about environmental protection. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the team from Re.Climate and Echo Analytics working behind the scenes today to make the webinar run smoothly. You might see them in the chat or in the Q&A, sharing their comments or answering your questions. We have Amber Bennett, the Executive Director of Re.Climate, James Bothroyd, the Project Director at Echo Analytics, Emma Bider and Niv Morthy, Re.Climate Resource and Training Coordinators, and Jen Mayville, the Strategic Services Director at Re.Climate. In our first webinar of the series last week, we had with us Dr. Eric LaChapelle of Echo Analytics and Dr. Louise Comeau, Re.Climate Senior Advisor, and they provided us a breakdown of the 5 audience segments in Canada. The segments are progressive activists, civic nationals, centrist liberals, disengaged middle, and fossil fuel conservatives. And this segmentation emerged from a survey of 6,000 Canadians and 13 focus groups aiming to understand, how to understand the 5 audiences, how to engage them around climate, their behaviors and their norms, and how best to reach them. And this webinar will be digging more into how to reach these 5 audiences. Our panels today will do some recap of the 5 segments, and then they will look into the engagement patterns and the needs of each segment or the different audience segments and how we can respond to these needs with tailored communication, but also covering some cross-cutting messaging and image recommendations that resonate across audience and multiple segments. And to bring these ideas into life, we also have with us Jamie Biggar, the co-founder of My Climate Plan, who will talk about their campaign, which successfully used the segmentation research to inform their campaign with the goal of doubling federal support for firefighters tackling wildfires that are increasing because of climate change. After the presentations from the 3 speakers, we will have time for questions. We will ask the panelists questions that we will be receiving from you today, and also questions that we have received from registrants in advance, and some questions that we didn't get to answer in our first webinar. Today, you will hear from Dr. Louise Comeau, one of the lead researchers of the 5 Canada. She is a senior advisor at Re.Climate and a member of the federal net zero advisory body. We will also hear from Chris Hatch, the co-author of the 5 Canada summary and the playbook, which we will share with you after this webinar. Chris is the former executive editor for Canada's National Observer, where he writes his weekly newsletter, Zero Carbon. We also have Jamie Biggar, the co-founder of My Climate Plan. Jamie has a long experience of founding organizations with high impact that empower people to improve their environment and economy and democracy. Thank you so much, Louise, Chris, and Jamie, for joining us today. And I will hand the mic to you, Louise, to kick us off.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We've been really looking forward to this webinar, which shifts a little bit from the data into much more of the discussion I think all of you are interested in, which is our communications practice. But I will start with just a bit of data before we dig a little bit deeper on, as I say, the practice side of things. The top extended arrows show the 5 segments, as Gada has mentioned, and they do kind of orient from more concerned about climate change on the left-hand side in terms of progressive activists to least concerned about climate change on the right side in terms of fossil fuel conservatives. And these numbers are quite stark. Progressive activists, for example, 92% of them are very concerned about climate. Civic nationals, 66%. Then we drop to 21% for centrist liberals, 8% for disengaged middle, and 0.6% for fossil fuel conservatives. And so one of the things we're trying to share with you is the opportunity to think about these segments. If you look at the first 3 segments, which may be the most important and engageable, we're looking at a proportion of the population that is reachable, but is different than the idea that often we hear around a disengaged middle. We would see that lump of the 30% that are the disengaged middle kind of over on the outside of our bell curve, if you will. If you look at these segments, however, from a different perspective, from their social and political values, and this is an important aspect of the segmentation work, you see something different. Progressive activists remain on the left side, being more progressive in terms of their social and political values. And then we start to move through, let's call them the range of traditionalist and moving to the right, moving into more of an authoritarian or hierarchical kind of set of values. And what you see is something that shifts quite significantly, where you see on the top, civic nationals are very concerned about climate change, but they are more socially and politically conservative. You see them on the bottom bar in the 4th, if you will, position, if you're looking at it from that perspective. You also see an interesting dynamic between more urban on the progressive side, more rural on the civic national side, more community oriented, and so on. And we'll dig well into all of these aspects. In the next slide, we're going to be looking at some of the engageable aspects of these segments. I'm just going to wait for Jen to pop that next slide up. There we are. We could tell you all sorts of things about these segments. If you want to look at the demographics in great detail, believe me, we've shared it all in the playbook that's coming, a summary of the segments, demographic data. We have a very technical report on the focus groups that we did. But I wanted to share with you here just the sense of how engageable are these groups. So let's look at the progressive activists, and we'll go across from left to right on the top here. In terms of answering the question in the original survey, would you be willing to join a campaign urging your provincial government to do more on climate change? And you see that we, in terms of the definitely, which I take much more seriously than the probably, we've got 21% of progressive activists, dropping to 12% with civic nationals, 3% for centrist liberals, and the disengaged middle. If you bring in the probablys, you get obviously much higher numbers. And there is an opportunity we'll talk about in terms of using those definitely peoples to engage those probable peoples. We also know that over time, more and more people trust family and friends on almost any topic. And here we know if we want to build social norms where people in the country see that climate action is what Canadians do, that this is something we all care about, then we need to talk to each other about climate change. In this case, progressive activists, 34% say they often talk to family and friends about climate change, while 22% of civic nationals do the same, and only 5% and 3% of the other two, what we consider engageable segments. We also, as communicators, spend a lot of time and a lot of investment in social media. And I must say, I was quite surprised to find this in the survey results that 24% of progressive activists engage on social media on climate change as a topic, 14% of civic nationals, and 5% and 8% in the other two segments. And this, I think, calls into question some of our emphasis on social media and whether or not we might want to be thinking about other opportunities there. we mentioned that we did 13 focus groups. These focus groups were populated with each of the segments. So they were people who had completed the original survey, who said they were willing to be part of a focus group. We randomly selected them from the pools who said they would and put them in focus groups with their tribe. And some things came out of these sessions that really stuck with me, so much so that we've tested it again in a survey, and I'll speak to that quickly. But what we did find was a lot of solutions skepticism. We have in terms of the segments, no one's arguing climate change isn't real, but we sure are having a debate about solutions. And when it comes to heat pumps and electric vehicles and renewable energy, there's a lot of skepticism. But more importantly, what I found in the focus groups was that people felt judged for having no choice about these technologies. Some of them resented the lack of help when they wanted to do it, and others felt that this was something that only wealthy elites could afford. We tested these ideas in our focus groups, and I was surprised. Almost half the population basically says they have no choice. Others, about 38%, said they would pursue options if there was help. And yet 64% of the population, at least in our survey, don't think energy efficiency programs make their lives more affordable. So we have some serious issues to deal with around solution skepticism and affordability. We also saw in the focus groups a strong sense of unfairness. And unfortunately, when you think policies are unfair or you can't afford them, there's a combination that goes on here. People tend to think these are unfair for me, and they are not supportive when they think things are unfair. And we'll talk more about that. Finally, there was a lot of conversation in the focus groups about Canada having little impact, that our emissions are low, that what we do doesn't matter. And this is something that you'll see us speaking to as we go forward in this webinar. Next slide, please. So what we got, I think, in terms of our analysis here is we do have a challenge and an opportunity. We really do want to engage with our progressive audiences and mobilize them more, but we also want to engage more with our socially and more politically conservative audiences. And we need to do that in ways that we may not, be aware of. Because their needs are particularly unique, if you will, or they're different, and we're not thinking about them in that way. Civic nationals come to mind as being, very community focused, nature connected. They are very concerned about climate solutions, particularly the carbon price. But there's a pathway to talking to them about climate change, and my sense is it's through climate impacts, adaptation, and preparedness. Next slide, please. This is my final slide and the one that I wanted to share with you the most. If you look at what we've got here, we see 3 columns. And this table is built around the different levels of self-determination of these segments. Now, this is being proposed as something we will test in our work here at Re.Climate over time. But if you look at the first column, and then I'll take you to the third column, and then we'll go to the center. And the idea here is that we've been discussing moving away from the idea of the movable middle more toward the idea of ladder of engagement and meeting people where they are. This is not going to surprise many of you. You're all professionals on this call. Many of you experienced with doing these things, but it's worth reinforcing. So if you look, for example, at progressive activists, and you're thinking about it from the perspective of where they are in terms of self-determination and engagement, they already have a very strong connection to the environment, to biocentric values, if you will. They're already intrinsically self-motivated. And we know from research with people like that overemphasizing money and awards, for example, can actually undermine their motivation. They want to hear more about climate progress. They want to be part of a community. They want to master new challenges. And so they have different needs. And this table and this column really lead you through that process. The third column is really about the less engaged segments, the centrist liberals and the disengaged middle. They require more nurturing. They need to be reminded or connected to their environmental values. You want to activate their feelings of connection and caring, empathy, wonder, and love for nature. They're not as active in terms of being self-determined, right? So they need to see role models, and you want to see those role models endorsing ideas and actions, encouraging conversations with friends and family. This is going to be a theme you'll see in the webinar. And you need to have opportunities for them to try new things. But the civic nationals, and this is our initial thinking about civic nationals, really bridge these two kind of worlds to some degree that I think is worth exploring. They're already connected on the environment, very, very much so. Very empathetic, very concerned about climate impacts, very concerned about nature. They hike, they camp, they are connected. They're more rural. And so we want to sustain those biocentric values for them. But they also may need not just to nurture feelings of belonging to a community, like we suggest with progressive activists, but we also may need to be profiling role models, for example, providing them opportunities to try new things, highlighting opportunities for setting goals and getting feedback, opportunities for them to make their own choices. This was really clear in the focus groups, making their own choices, which means you may have to provide a hierarchy of choice in your communications. Anyway, I'll close there. Just as the beginning of our thinking about how to engage our segments. And I think the idea of self-determination and looking at that scale and that progression of engagement is really an opportunity to apply self-determination theory, if you will, to our work. And now I'll hand this conversation over to Chris.
Thanks, Louise. I want to share just a few of the big takeaways. And here we're going to talk about things that apply across the segments, things that move the conversation forward, as we found in the focus groups, and things we really have to address if you're not going to get stuck. And not to leave you hanging, here is the thing we found that is most effective across segments if you're wanting to spark a conversation about moving assertive policies forward, actually cutting fossil fuel pollution. We found you want to be talking about holding big polluters accountable through regulation. A number of reasons this is important. One is that really it's the one exception to the rule that people really resist: bans, restrictions, limits, mandates, all that kind of thing. The exception to that is around pollution, and especially big polluters. There, people do naturally incline towards limits, regulations, those kinds of things. And this frame we found very useful for a few reasons. One is that it gets at the primary cause of climate change, the burning of fossil fuels. And we still have a huge problem, as we saw through the survey and focus groups, that this is not yet established as the mental model that people hold in their heads about how climate change works. And holding big polluters accountable starts to get us at that big primary cause. It also orients towards systemic solutions. So much of the debate has been focused on, how the burden is falling on consumers, especially during an affordability crisis. And here we orient towards government regulation on pollution coming from electricity, the oil and gas sector, transportation, systemic solutions. And it opens a conversation about accountability and fairness, about who's doing their fair share and the need for regulation to make sure big polluters are held accountable to do their fair share. So that's the first big thing I wanted to bring across. And it's sort of, how to move a conversation about assertive policies forward. The second point on the next slide is a more defensive one. As Louise mentioned, one of the things we ran across over and over and over and over and again is that the solutions are not realistic, and that Canada is a tiny part of the problem. So people think we're doing a lot and it's not fair because we're a tiny little part of the problem. And there's enough truth in this that it is not helpful to glide by it or deny it. And what we found is that it's really important to acknowledge that, yes, climate change is a big global problem. Yes, we are much smaller than the US, much smaller than China. So acknowledge that first, and then move into sort of a yes and. You'll find your own arguments probably with the audience you're talking with. But one thing that really does seem to shock people is the size of Canada. So yes, we're smaller than the US and China, but we are the 11th largest fossil fuel polluter in the world, one of the top 12 in the world. And other G7 countries, our peers, including the United States, have cut fossil fuel pollution much more than we have, and we're lagging behind. And similarly, with investments in clean energy, there are record-setting investments going on around the globe, and this is somewhere Canada really needs to step up and do our fair share as well. The third point on the next slide that you'll see is that there is a general vague desire for action, but people feel alone, and there's not really a social norm, as Louise was saying, that climate action is something we do. They feel alone and they feel ineffective. And so one of the things that really does seem to work is to validate the desire for action by talking in terms of, it's not like Canada needs to take action or let's take urgent action now. It's join with the millions of Canadians who already want action. And it's one of those places actually where it can be even useful to be specific. So, you take a poll like Angus Reid, 63% of Canadians think there should be more immediate action. That translates into over 25 million people. And when you put it in that frame, it really does give people a sense that they're not alone, they're part of something bigger, and it validates their desire for action. The fourth point is around messengers. And there are commonalities to who people trust across segments. Especially for the top two segments that we're looking at, progressive activists and civic nationals, they trust scientists, doctors, and affected people. And there is one key point here, which is when we talk about scientists, they're thinking of people who have frontline expertise. And then, as we mentioned earlier, also friends and family, absolutely crucial, if anything, becoming more crucial. It's really important that people hear other people in their orbit talking about climate change. It dramatically increases the amount of perceived efficacy, the amount of people's sense that something can be done about it if they're hearing other people talking about the issue in their orbit. And finally, we looked at a lot of different images. I'm not going to get too deeply into this. As communicators, you probably know that the image on the left, the kind of fun in the sun imagery around heat waves, is super unhelpful. What is helpful, what really does motivate people and galvanize them, is other people. So it's really crucial when you're communicating through images in posts and whatever, to show people, ideally with their faces, and to be communicating risks to people's health and people's safety. People also respond really well to images of people helping people. There was an interesting finding around wildfire. You'd think that wildfire images would be super motivating and galvanizing. Not the case, actually, because so much wildfire imagery is, a mountainside on fire, looks really cool in a certain way, or the aftermath, burnt out area, homes, whatever, which is sad for sure, but doesn't have the same kind of human impact. So one of the things we've been playing with, and we recommend would love to hear from you if you experiment with it, is when we're doing wildfire images, to do it in collections of images, together, superimposed. So you can have the fire, but also a picture, of a person where you can see their face, firefighter, homeowner, lost their home, whatever it is. And I'll leave you with the last slide. This is just a sampling of the kind of thing that you'll find in the broader report. We've hit on a lot of these points already, but you'll see that one of the big themes is that a lot of climate communication is really quite abstract, and it's much more effective when you can move to something concrete and real. So we talk about tackling climate change a lot, and it's such a vague thing, right? Like, what is tackling climate change? Like, who's causing climate change? Who does the tackling? So that's where, consider moving towards the frame of regulating big corporate polluters, for example. Same with extreme weather. A lot of people, everyone talks about the weather, and people do have a general sense that things are getting worse, but it's helpful to zero right in that this is not natural. This is going to keep getting worse. This is a result of climate change. Similarly, reducing emissions, like what's an emission? What's a greenhouse gas emission? Focus in on fossil fuel pollution and the fact that climate change just keeps getting worse and worse and worse until we zero out fossil fuel pollution. And, we work to embed that as the mental model that people have in their heads about what needs to happen. And we talked about we need action. Better to, instead of saying something like we need action, which again is sort of vague and inchoate, you want to join with the millions of Canadians who want our governments to hold big polluters accountable. And I will pass over to Jamie to talk about an actual case study in bringing all of this into practice.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, everybody from Re.Climate and Eco Analytics for hosting this, and everybody for attending. I'm going to take you now through a case study about how we used the advice from Re.Climate in our campaign over this past summer. And really, the story that I'm going to tell is rooted in the new organization that we've been created. It's called My Climate Plan. And actually, you heard it here first. We'll probably change the name to have a bit more of a collective name in the not too distant future. But the inspiration for this organization, one of the sources for inspiration was a report called Preparation Frame, written by Kara Pike with Climate Access, key collaborator with Re.Climate, about how to reach folks who are outside of the climate alarmed base in moments when they are really experiencing what they perceive to be climate change. And so our mission here is to help everyone live in a climate safe community. We imagine ourselves in 25 years, everyone's living in a community that is prepared for future climate, that is free of climate pollution, and that is stronger and welcoming for people who have really faced those disruptions in their lives. And the way that we do that is we meet people in the moments when they are experiencing climate alarm, as unnatural weather. We tap into folks' personal motivation through advocacy campaigns and a platform that helps people to make a plan to prepare for climate change, and then channel that into a membership organization supporting each other to help win collective wins. And so in this particular campaign, over the course of this summer, we go to the next slide, we were focused on two different parts of that work then, both really working from the Re.Climate playbook. So on the one hand, meeting people as they were experiencing extreme heat waves with content where the messengers were doctors, in this case, Dr. Brar, encouraging people to understand these unnatural heat waves as being a result of climate change, and then supporting them and being able to prepare for those heat waves, form heat buddies, and be able to take care of themselves, their households, and their communities. And we also began our first advocacy campaign Thank you to Re.Climate for sharing, coming up with the frame, Don't Let Canada Burn, and then allowing us to use that as the frame for this campaign. And here on the note of messengers, we have Harold Larson, a veteran firefighter, who has been our primary spokesperson for the Don't Let Canada Burn campaign, which we'll chat about now a bit more on the next slide. Oh, sorry, one more piece before that. No, thank you. Please do go to the next slide. My bad. I forgot that this slide was in between the two. I want to speak a little bit more then to our approach to targeting during summer extremes in particular. So we start really with climate impacted areas, places that are experiencing these climate impacts. So in this case, on this map, what you are seeing, the green outline is, this is from the insurance industry web tool. It's called CAT IQ for catastrophic loss events. This is the path of a very powerful storm through southwestern Ontario. And then one layer on top of them, the climate impacts that people across Canada are experiencing, we look at movable middle ridings. And so you can see then there's the blue, there's the red, there's the orange, and where there's the lighter colors, the lighter pink, the lighter blues, those are places where the vote has been very close between the different parties, places the politicians really pay attention to, and places where there are a lot of these folks who are outside of either the deep fossil fuel conservatives or the progressive activists. So we've then further focused in on civic nationals, and in particular focused in on civic nationals in Atlantic Canada. So looking at the age profile, the education profile of civic nationals, and places where census data shows us that there are a lot of civic nationals living there. We have further then led with a focus on women. And one of the reasons that we've done that is that we find that when you use Facebook in our case, and we've used Facebook as our Facebook advertising as our primary tool for reaching people over the course of this past summer, because civic nationals are on Facebook in very high numbers. When you build an audience and bring people together on Facebook, it is very hard to have an audience with a lot of men in it. That it also includes a lot of folks who are from movable middle, in this case, civic national audience, without getting quite a few climate deniers in there. So we start off with leading with women in our targeting to build up that more supportive and open audience to begin with, and then bring in men after. So the next slide, our campaign, what was called Don't Let Canada Burn, borrowed from Re.Climate. Thank you very much again. The focus of it then is being on doubling the support for our firefighters to fight double the fires because of climate change. So the campaign has implicit in it the recognition that our climate is changing and that impact is devastating for people, and foregrounding the role of firefighters on the front lines of climate change, and the actually incredibly poor conditions and lack of support that they experience as they're working to defend us all. And I'm happy to share an update, which is that we actually delivered this petition on Parliament Hill this morning. Harold Larson was there, as was folks, climate disaster survivors from across Canada. And I understand that the Canadian press picked up the press conference, so I'm very pleased to hear that. And thank you for Re.Climate on the support on that. Okay, if we go to the next slide then. I want to chat a little bit about the first wave of creative that we did. And this was in late July and early August, while the Jasper wildfires, the devastating, tragic Jasper wildfires, were fresh in the news. And so our first three kinds of creative that we produced, one was the fire montage images, in particular showing that there were fires all across Canada. So communities from Atlantic Canada to the British Columbia coast being impacted by these wildfires. Our second piece of creative was a video from Harold Larson, veteran wildfire fighter, calling on people to sign the petition. And our third video then was from our farmer, Abby Scaglione, talking about the impacts of climate change on her farm and the threat of wildfire to her farm, and with a real message of thanking firefighters for their work and calling on people to support them. The results were very strong. The average, at this point, the average cost in Facebook ads per signature, so to recruit a person to sign your petition online, is about $3 to $12 per signature. And Harold Larson's video in particular came in at just 70 cents. So almost an order of magnitude higher performing than the average ad recruiting somebody to sign a petition. It also had very good comments. What we saw was people were keen to support the firefighters and the farmers who were asking them as a call to action on this, felt very sympathetic to them and wanted to help. We were really curious, though, and of course, I know this will be of great interest to everybody who is watching and participating today. We wanted to make sure that we could then make a direct link to fossil fuel accountability. And so the link to fossil fuel accountability was present throughout the petition text itself, talking about the need to move to a clean energy economy and get off of fossil fuels. And we followed up in a survey to everybody who had signed the petition to ask them where the money to double wildfire fighter support should come from. Should it come from general government revenue, or should it come from the people, the big polluters most responsible for climate change? And what we found was that, yes, 72.7% want the money to come from big polluters most responsible for climate change, which we're very happy to see. And some folks have been surprised that that wasn't all the way up at 100% if you're given that choice. But I think that partially speaks to the fact that for the 27.3%, if I'm doing the math right, who thought the money should come from general revenue, or were unsure, that we really are, with this campaign, reaching a lot of folks who are truly outside of the progressive activist space, and meaningfully kind of swing either way in terms of their preferences on this issue. Go to the next slide. So I'm going to speak now to the second wave of creative that we did, and this came much later. It came in September, end of September and early October. We've focused further in on civic nationals. So thank you to Re.Climate, Louise in particular, for the suggestions to add different interest areas to the Facebook targeting. We've focused more on folks around birding and around gardening and other outdoor activities that really unite a lot of folks in the civic nationals. And the second wave of creative focused on the voices of climate disaster survivors. So we're going to take a pause here to listen to this ad put together with interviewing Megan Fandrich, a survivor of the Lytton fire.
My name is Megan Fandrich. I used to own a coffee shop that was an art cafe, so it had local art, and we roasted our own beans, and we had delicious baking, and it was such a lovely space. And really often we would see firefighters come in, and I would see them in fire season, and I would watch them as the season progressed, as they got more and more exhausted, run down, burnt out. Like, you could see it in their faces, just how they ordered their cappuccino. And that little cafe was destroyed by wildfire when the town of Lytton burned on June 30th, 2021. I miss it. And the firefighters that I used to see there are still out there. They're still fighting fires. They lost their homes in the Lytton fire, and they are still there. They saved big parts of our community in the surrounding area. They save so many people and so many homes and so many forests every year. But climate change is making these fires worse. Climate change is making these fires burn hotter with more intensity. There are more fires. We see it. We see it every summer, every unprecedented summer. I really encourage everyone to sign the Don't Let Canada Burn petition, because we need to get firefighters the support that they deserve.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching that and the supportive comments in the chat. I really want to emphasize, we added in some of the visuals, but I really want to emphasize how much those are Megan Fandrich's own words. She improvised that script on the spot and delivered it. Just a really incredible person. And that experience for us has been very common in speaking to many climate disaster survivors, that they just have incredibly powerful stories and are so eloquent and so powerful and so moving in speaking to what they're seeing. And what we then saw in terms of the concrete results from that video is that it was actually the strongest performing ad that we released through the entire period, even higher performing than the video that we put out with Harold Lorson, the firefighter, in the aftermath of the Jasper fires, coming out months after it was headline news. And this has shifted our perception of the need to have the voices of these climate disaster survivors being meeting people only in the moments when folks are seeing it in the news. These voices are powerful, powerful long after the event has happened, which has shifted our perception of our strategy around this. And speaking to that on the next slide, what I want to take you through then are questions that we have around. So we've connected with these people initially. What does follow-up look like? So one of our primary ways of following up with people is a weekly newsletter that really focuses on advice around community building stories, solutions, news, asks for lots of input. So for example, taking Wildfire Fighter to Ottawa to deliver the petition, that's something the community voted on, something we did today. And it shares stories, norming action and foregrounding these folks on the front lines, like that Nova Scotia power crews from across the province were ready to head to Tampa, Florida to help ahead of Hurricane Milton. We've seen strong engagement with this newsletter. The general benchmark for nonprofits is 29% open rate. We've seen an open rate of 35 to 60%, multiple emails in the 50+% range. One of the strongest performing subject lines was backyard ice rinks and smoke-free summers, a subject line that really speaks to people and Civic Nationals' experiences of climate change and the things that they're worried about losing. We have some next steps then looking at this slide. Some of our immediate questions are around seasons of engagement. So moving out of the hot season of the summer, the heat waves and fires, we've been looking now to support people in planning and preparing for storms and floods, like what we see with Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. Also been asking some questions around the right channels for engaging people. Email remains, from a digital communications perspective, one of the best ways to keep being able to engage with people and to be able to follow up with people. And of course, to be able to do that without spending money. But it does look like there are a cohort of Civic Nationals who really would prefer to stay on Facebook. And so thinking about how we can keep following up with those folks on Facebook, especially because once they've signed a petition, we have the ability to do that more easily. This chart here that you see is looking at, there's about 125,000 people in your average federal riding. What would it look like to be able to regularly reach 30,000 of them, and who would include a lot of those folks then who are Civic Nationals or centrist liberals, in addition to the progressive activists. That translates, if you think then about, say, 45 climate impacted swing ridings across the country, to about 1.35 million people. If we can regularly reach these folks with these kinds of campaigns and content, could we contribute to climate proofing Canadian politics for good, no matter which politicians in power, on the road to a 10-year organizing goal of being able to recruit 100,000 members in these impact ridings, climate impacted and swing ridings, using the messaging and messengers playbook that's being developed by Re.Climate. And finally, going to the next slide then, I just want us to pause for a moment. I want us to pause for a moment to appreciate something. And this is an incredible audience. Everybody who's here, and you can see it. You can see it in the comments. This is an incredible audience of people working on climate change in Canada. And so I just want us to pause for a moment to appreciate that in these polarized times, at the forefront, at the front lines of billion-dollar information wars, living in a country that has the fourth largest proven oil reserves in the entire world. Let's just take a moment to pause, that people across Canada will listen to climate disaster survivors and be moved to act outside of the regular folks that we're able to reach on climate change. I think that that's really inspiring and really motivating says good things about us as a collective. So thank you for your time. Would really love to learn together. Excited for the Q&A. You can go to myclimateplan.com to get the weekly newsletter and check us out if you'd like. And please really encourage you to reach out to us. My email is jamie@myclimateplan.com if you'd be interested in learning together or collaborating. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie, for your work. And thanks for the people who shared their stories with you. And congratulations on the success of your campaign. This is wonderful. And thank you, Louise, and thanks, Chris, for your great presentation. So we're gonna open up for questions. And as a reminder, please share your questions in the Q&A. I see the questions, there are some already, but if you have one, please do now. And we'll start with some questions before getting the questions from people attending. And this question is for you, Louise. You talked about role models, and role models seem to play a huge role in getting the less engaged segments, namely like the civic nationals, centrist liberals, and the disengaged middle, to get them into action. So my question for you is like, what kind of role models do we need for these segments, and what makes these role models effective in getting people off the fence into climate action?
There's a great little quote that I remember from my PhD days. It comes from Aristotle. To be excellent, you have to see excellence. You model excellence from seeing excellence. And so that's what we need our role models for. We do emulate the people around us who we care about. We all know that. And so in the context of thinking about role models, a few things have come up in the work I've done is people tend to perceive, if you say to them, do you think of yourself as a role model? They'll say, oh, no, I'm not that excellent. I'm not up at the top of the pyramid. No, we're all role modeling every minute of the day. And it's a big responsibility, I guess, to some degree. But when I'm thinking of that process from the perspective of the segments, obviously they're going to need to be somewhat different. If you're someone in the more or less engaged segments, you want to match their demographics to some degree. Progressive activists tend to be more in the managerial class, if you will, and so we can go have a policy conversation over there. But that's not what's happening over in the other segments, right? You're thinking more of people like yourself, whatever the diversity dynamics are in your demographics, whether it's a rural person for you. I mean, Jamie's just done such a fantastic job of that. More working class for civic nationals, for example. And so you want role models that people can identify with, that says, that is something I can do too. That is exactly what that is. But the idea that to be excellent, we have to see excellence is something I think we've forgotten and need to think a little bit more about. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And so role models is one way, but also social norms is a huge thing as well. And the best way to transmit these social norms is actually talking with family and friends. And this is one of the takeaways that we got from the last webinar and this webinar. And there were questions actually in both webinars about these conversations with family and friends. What is the best way to normalize these climate conversation without feeling we're getting into politics? And also there is a question about like what kind of conversations that should be. It's like about how climate change is human induced. Is that about like impact? Is that the solution? Is it about the education? So I'd like to invite you, Louise and Chris, to answer this question for us.
And perhaps, I'm not sure if Emma's got them quickly at hand, and if not, we'll include it in the follow-up resources. But there's some very useful material out there on this very question. The first thing that I would say, and again, hats off to Jamie, you start by talking about what you love. You really actually do. What is it that we each care about? What is it that you talk from a place of values, care? If you both like camping, if you both like, in our world, I live in a rural environment, if we like hunting or whatever it is, you find your shared experience, and then you talk about that shared experience and what you might have noticed about those things that activity, that place that you care about, the places that you grew up. You know, you really do want to connect at that level of the heart before you get into anything else. And there is some very, very important advice about how to do that, to connect at values. Catherine Hayhoe is one. John Cook is another. Andrew Hoffman is another. Very, very good work that it leads into the story that you recognize that identity is influencing how you're interpreting this information. And so the last place you start is politics. But you can get a long way through talking about what you each care about, and be patient and listen to each other, and take the time, come back to conversations over time. In some of my climate classes, I assign my students to have a conversation about climate change with somebody. It's often the first time they've ever done it. And they have conversations with their parents and their boyfriends and girlfriends. And they're surprised that they were afraid to do that before. And so we can do these things, but it does take some care.
Great, thank you, Louise. Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think that we're talking about kind of two very different kinds of communication. Most of the webinar we're talking about sort of campaigns, delivering programs to the broader world. When it comes to one-on-one conversation, it's like, I think the main thing is you're just trying to break climate silence and establish that this is an okay thing to talk about. You're not going to get a full like message triangle, complete narrative. You're not trying to deliver a message. You're just trying to break the silence and I think open the conversation. So one of the places where I think it can be really useful is to be vulnerable about, obviously for so many of us, we're at some level terrified about where this is all headed, and doubly so because it just doesn't seem to be, no one seems to be taking it seriously when you look out on the street, right? And so say that, like I'm in British Columbia, we just had an election. Literally election day was an atmospheric river washing houses away and cars. And it really was just not part of the conversation. So in talking to people, it would be me, expressing like how that freaks me out, which, can give other people the opening to, also have a heartfelt response to it, not a political one.
This is sad, but thank you for the insight. Jamie, I think this is like, it's interesting that, you had a success with your campaign, and your campaign was on Facebook, the firefighter campaign. And I'm just like, I'm trying to reconcile this with the research results about engagement of all segments of social media. So Louise shared that they're not engaging much. They're especially when posting about climate change or to support climate action. So the question is that, did you notice that in your campaign, that low engagement? And if so, did you switch things up to get more engagement? Did you focus on different kinds of interactions?
Thank you. Yeah, I want to start by saying that, all things being equal, I would much prefer not to be putting energy and money into Facebook. For I think lots of great reasons, and several folks in the chat raised this during the presentation, and I agree with you. The advantage of Facebook has two main advantages, and I think reasons why we can't ignore it. The first is that while people posting about climate change specifically, and in some of these audiences outside, these segments outside of the progressive activists, while people themselves posting about it may be lower, that is partially, I think, a phenomenon of them seeing it as a very polarizing issue, and not wanting to kind of get in trouble with their friends and family if they're posting on it, being worried about that. I think that's understandable and a legitimate concern for folks who don't want to experience that kind of controversy. but that doesn't mean that they themselves aren't on Facebook. And
Mm.
so if the question as organizers is, how can we meet people where they're at? Part of the answer to that, especially if we're looking at suburban and rural Canada and we're looking at older folks, is that Facebook is one of the most effective ways to reach people,
Mm.
even if they themselves are not as likely to post or to share
Mm.
as they might be if say they were in the progressive activist circles. So that's one piece, and then I think the other piece is um, we well, then one more after this, we did experience, especially with the spokespeople being folks from the different Re.Climate suggested messengers, that there was an appreciation for hearing from them, and there were like much more positive comment sections. So I think the engagement with those messengers was actually very, very good and very strong. Um, but I also don't want to present our work over the summer as like the be all and end all or as a perfect example. I think there's lots of work now to be done
Mm.
by many folks that we're keen to learn from, and also some of our own work and learning in taking these kinds of campaign work into other spaces. At the moment, we're experimenting with some billboards in different parts of Nova Scotia. I
Mm.
think the birders and the gardeners notes, there's lots of room for face-to-face organizing, meeting folks at the groups that they're already a part of, and getting off of social media and doing that work in face-to-face conversations.
Perfect. Thank you. So we have now, so I'll share some questions that we're receiving, and I would like to let everyone know that we have more time in this webinar for questions as we extended the time. And this is one of the things that was requested from our first webinar, to have more time for people's questions. So the questions that I'm going to ask you, Louise and Chris, is that it's about youth. So there was one question about how does the information shared in this webinar square against engaging youth who are deeply concerned about and impacted by climate change. And then there's also another question about how do we reconcile the fact that most climate concerned population who are youth are behind the rise of the growth of far right internationally in Canada and in British Columbia, which are actively anti-climate. So I think there are two parts for this question, but it's like, what did you learn from the research about talking to youth in general? Like that would be, I think that would be the right way to answer both questions at the same time.
I can start a little bit with some of the survey work and focus group work, not just this, but over a long period of time. I think something that people might not realize is that in data, you'll often see youth and people 60 plus have the same perspectives. Equally concerned about climate change, often more supportive of various policy positions. And that's because the folks in the middle are the ones with the kids and the mortgage and the jobs, and they're exhausted and they have to deal with what's on their plate right now. I've long seen an opportunity for what I'm calling, and we saw this with the Seniors for Climate campaign, a real opportunity to reach across the generations, where young people and their grandparents, there's an enormous opportunity, I think, for that cross-generational programming. And a lot of the people that are in my age cohort, we're ready. We want to play. And so we see that opportunity. Second thing that I would say, though, is I'm not sure I would characterize what's happening to youth as being anti-climate. It is pro-survival. And it very much, in my view, fits with, and I see this a lot in the focus groups, and we've done over the years many of these focus groups. You might disagree with some elements of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but let's for the moment, when security values are threatened, all bets are off, and you often will see concern for climate change rise and fall, for example, with whatever's happening in the economy. When the economy is good, right? People feel generous. We're more open and we're more capable of pro-social behaviors and support for pro-social policies. When you can't, you're worried about your rent and your food is too expensive, that other stuff has to go in the background, and you become more concerned about what's happening with your family and yourself. And as a young person, you're trying to make your way. You're just trying to get started. And so I think there's, and it was clear in the focus groups that there is a feeling, and you know, some might argue how much is real, how much is imagined. You know, I'm not going to go into that, but there is a real perception and feeling, and it's very much in the survey that Ecoanalytics did, that basically the system is rigged against the little guy, and that big polluters use their power to take advantage, and that no one's really helping me. And so the populist message is getting through to the working class on those grounds. And so I just put all that right there. Second thing is misinformation. We cannot minimize the effect that misinformation is having. And then the third piece, just to keep reminding ourselves, people do care. They're just having personal concerns right now in terms of their social security. I mean, their personal security, their household security. And there are opportunities for grandparents and grandchildren to do something powerful on climate change, I think in Canada and around the world.
Great, thank you. Chris, is there anything you want to add to this question? Or, I mean, to answer this question?
I mean, I think it's even more acutely a problem with young men, which goes to, you know, the points we were talking about earlier around role modeling and that kind of thing. And certainly there seems, you know, we're finding a lot of trouble with youth that did get really involved in you know, the youth climate strikes and all. There was that huge surge of momentum, which people feel like kind of dissipated. And there were a lot of people feeling really deflated. And so I think that really speaks to the importance of the join with millions of Canadians kind of messaging, that it has not gone away. People still care. You know, concerns are always going to fluctuate up and down. You know, it's impossible to maintain that kind of momentum just kind of indefinitely higher and higher and higher. It's going to fluctuate. And even without pandemics and everything else. And I think it's just really important that there be an underlying message reassuring people that there are, you know, a huge majority of Canadians who want this taken seriously. And, you know, it's that whole, it's not just we need action now, it's join with 25 million Canadians, join with millions of Canadians kind of message that I think can help.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Molly. This question is for you, Jamie, and this is for Molly. What was the timeline on the campaigns? What was the process for finding survivors and trusted messengers? How did you build connection and trust with them?
That's a great question. Thank you for that, Molly. And I'm actually not the best person on my team to answer it. Because there are a couple of other folks on the team, Adam Lyonsford and Bailey Dunyo in particular, who have held those relationships and have been very, very strong on that and done so with quite a lot of intention. So with Harold and the wildfire fighters, the initial outreach began, I would say 6 months before the summer. And actually the route to finding Harold was beginning to Google for wildfire fighters who had written about the plight of wildfire fighters in the country. And we found that he had published on the issue, he'd been interviewed on the issue. He now transitioned to becoming a structural firefighter because it is so grueling and unsustainable to be a wildfire fighter. And then reached out to him. Adam reached out to him. I didn't do that work. I think, unfortunately, going back to, I think we reached out to him through Facebook to go back to that particular channel. And he was really happy to connect with us and to have a chance to spread and to share his message. So
Great.
somewhat similarly then with Megan Fandrich and the other climate disaster survivors, they were initially there were folks who had been interviewed by the media in the aftermath of the Lytton fires and the Kelowna fires, in the case of one of the other fire survivors. They were then folks that brought them to earlier in the fall when the climate disaster survivors spoke in Ottawa, and grilling fossil fuel executives. They were brought there by other organizations, and those other organizations helped to facilitate that connection. And since then, we're now seeing this. Since then, there have been essentially word has started spreading through folks in fire impacted communities that were doing this work. And so Adam and Bailey are now beginning to be introduced to more folks and holding more relationships and just building and holding that trust over time. So it took time, and I think there is now a real question for us around how to hold these relationships well and earn this trust and keep re-earning this trust over time. I want to do a quick shout out on that note to the work of the Climate Disaster Project, who the folks out at UVic, they have a very trauma-informed approach around holding relationships with climate disaster survivors, and that's an area of capability that we're now looking to build within our own team. Thank you for asking.
Yeah. Thank you. And I would love to hear from you about how you maintain that relationship in the future. Probably we'll have a webinar in the future about how we can do that. And this question for all of you guys, and it's about this question is actually from Adam and Rob, and it's about left coding. The question goes we, like, as progressive activists, many of our basic communication habits are left coded. The use of the land acknowledgement, the pronouns, so it's baked in our communication. So what's the risk of civic nationals falling off our ladder of engagement purely by accident? Is this a non-starter for reaching the civic nationals?
Well, let me start here. So, I really think it's a discipline we need to think about, because it is triggering for civic nationals in particular. People do have different perspectives. We see that clearly in the segments, from socially and politically progressive views to more conservative views. And yet we have such a large amount of territory upon which we can engage with each other through love of nature and connectedness to nature and concerns about climate impacts. And so let's take civic nationals in particular. I wouldn't start a conversation with them talking about carbon pricing. Let me just tell you that. I sure as heck wouldn't start talking about, they're very concerned right now about high levels of immigration and our ability to absorb them. And they do feel that we need to take care of the people who are here now before we, open the doors as widely as we have in the last couple of years. That's clear from the data. And so, yes, in our focus groups, we also tested whether people understood the term justice, which is like a basic piece of language that every progressive activist uses. And I just want to share one more time that people don't know what it means. And I just shared a piece of research with Emma. If she might still have the link, she can post it. A global study on the question of climate justice. Is it a term that's understood? It is not. But people do understand fairness. Civic nationals understand the term fairness, and we can really connect on fairness. And so if we do that little bit of work of adjusting our language and our entry points, we can open conversations. And so, yeah, it is the case that some of the language and the ways that we may be engaging with people can be threatening to others. And if you want to have a conversation, then it's a decision we have to make.
Great. Thank you. Chris, Jamie, you want to add anything?
Yeah, definitely a problem. And when you look at the segmentation, it's an acute problem because the two most accessible, most motivated segments that we have are the progressive activists and the civic nationals, and really quite different political and social values. So if we're serious about building a mandate where, politically irresistible mandate for action in the country, we really do have to be able to mobilize both segments without pissing off one or the other. That's sort of why we were presenting those frames today that do cut across both, what opens the door to more action, which is holding big polluters accountable through regulation, underline the systemic piece of that, the need for government regulation, and defensively, addressing this Canada is so small we don't matter problem. And the other piece that we heard consistently in the focus groups is that the solutions are just not realistic, not at the kind of scale that we're talking about. So I feel like, those three pieces for sure cut across the segments in a way that doesn't trigger one or the other.
All right. Thank you. And I think, just to add is I think the value of this research is that, it doesn't put people into, like liberals and conservative, but rather it's really looking for commonalities and shared language and different entries that we can use. And this is what I personally appreciate from the work Louise and Eco-Analytics, you've done of opening these possibilities of conversations, that we could have dismissed in our previous communication. So this question is for Jamie. Wonder about inclusion in all campaigns. I noticed the photos and the video of white people, and the persons we've heard are white. Is this something you're working on?
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate that question. So I'll go by in the chat. I think a couple notes on that. So, and actually, it's a good segue in some ways to the last question that we were just discussing. So, one piece on that then is that particularly in the other work that we were doing this summer, focusing on helping people to prepare for climate impacts, we were foregrounding folks of color. Dr. Brar, the physician of South Asian descent, and was then in our kind of targeting on the Facebook messaging was also her message was going to everyone, and it was also particularly going to some areas of the country where we know there's a higher proportion of folks of South Asian descent, as a way of doing that really intentional and specific outreach. This morning in the press conference that we did in Ottawa, two of the speakers were Indigenous from bands just outside of Kelowna that were deeply fire impacted over the last couple of years. And in general, I think that's an incredibly important part of the wildfire work, is to highlight how disproportionately impacted Indigenous communities are by wildfire in Canada. The numbers on that are just incredibly stark in terms of the proportions of people displaced by wildfires every year, the percentage of them that are Indigenous in Canada. And I want to come back then to that question around trying to build a inclusive, cross-partisan coalition that was able to reach folks who are civic nationals, is able to reach progressive activists, is able to reach into some folks who are centrist liberals and in the disengaged middle, without triggering some of the current like far right messaging around immigration in particular. And on our end, our main approach to that then has been twofold. First, setting up intentionally from the beginning as an international organization. So we highlight stories and messages from folks around the world. In particular, we're highlighting a lot of cooperation between the United States and Canada around Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, and focusing on the stories of individual people. And so this was one of our experiences. I worked at change.org for a few years before coming to do this work. One of the things that we found was that if you asked people to sign a petition that said, do you support more immigration to the United States, full stop, there was a whole chunk of folks who would not support that. But if you ask those same people if a specific immigrant from Guatemala should be able to stay in the country, working and supporting his family, those same people would support that. They'd say, yes, absolutely, that person should be able to stay. And so in the follow-up messaging that we're doing with folks, being able to show a wide range of diversity and folks being impacted around the world is really important to us, and a piece that we're able to do ongoing listening and testing through having that newsletter and seeing, what are folks clicking on, what are folks unsubscribing from. So more to come on that. I agree that it's incredibly important and a piece that we're going to bake into the work going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie.
Gada, would you mind if I just shared something that just comes to me from the focus groups on some of these points? I was stunned at how empathetic civic nationals were. They just wear their hearts on their sleeves. There were tears over the effect on animals of the wildfires, for example. And I just want to, just kind of put, we might think these are folks we don't know, but you all know civic nationals. And I live in a rural environment. These are my neighbors. And so, on some of the points where there might be some contention, certain topics I wouldn't necessarily raise with my neighbors. But we can definitely talk to each other about the things that they love. And so I just wanted to make that point that Jamie's making around the thinking about the people that are here and caring for those people. There's an empathy that you can activate there. We don't have to agree on everything, but civic nationals, you might think socially conservative and think maybe more angry, because we tend to associate that with populism. There's frustration, but there's big hearts. And I really kind of just don't be afraid to go and talk to a civic national.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Louise. And this question is about a different frame. It's about the security or insecurity. So this question is from Nicole, and it's for all of you guys, is that considering the growing national interest in the insecurity and security, particularly amongst more politically conservative segments, I'm wondering if anyone has comments or experiences trying to link climate change with a narrative around insecurity.
This is such an important point. People want to feel safe. If we are reading any of the analysis of what's going on with populism, it is exactly this issue that they are looking for an often more authoritarian voice that can help them feel safe in uncertain times when you're feeling insecure and perhaps that threatened and doing all the things that you think are the right things to do. And so this question of safety, I would not want to underestimate the power of what Jamie is doing around preparedness, because it is a safety question. It is about control and having control. And that is what's happening. And one of the reasons why the rise of populism is so effective is it imposes the idea of gaining or having control in an environment where you are feeling out of control. So I think that is a very a powerful point, and there's quite a bit of really, really good research on this at the moment. And from a communications point of view and from a program point of view, the more we can do to help people feel safe and prepared and secure while we're solving climate change, that would be a good ticket.
All right, I can go to the next question, and this is a question that, again, I'm asking every one of you guys, is that a lot of the conversations and policy solutions tend to be mitigation focused, but we're seeing increasing numbers of people thinking climate change is natural. And this question we have received from one of the registrants. I wonder if you have done any analysis about messaging that is focused on climate adaptation versus climate mitigation. I think, Chris, do you want to start? Chrissy, you're unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, not to get into the studies and surveys on this, but at the broad level, this is a distinction that only people like the kind of people on this call make. The normal people don't think about adaptation versus mitigation. To the extent they're thinking about climate change, they're thinking about, you know, what do we do? Like, you know, is it seawalls? Is it electric vehicles? It's all a bundle of things. And I feel like it's a fool's errand to try and tease those things apart. I think Louise hit the right frame there. It's about, on the one hand, keeping us safe, you know, quote unquote, as best we can. And the flip side of that is, you know, that we're being betrayed, and we need political leaders to step up and keep us safe. So we broaden the definition of what a solution is, which is both, you know, cooling centers for heat waves, fire smart programs to protect communities, and also addressing the root cause, that we need to do all of these things together. We've got to, you know, get regulations to get fossil fuel burning emissions down to zero as part of it, but that yeah, it's not one or the other for the public at large.
Thank you. Jamie, Louise, you want to add to that?
Sure, thank you. I really agree with what Chris is saying around it being like a kind of a bundle in most folks' minds. And as part of that, really trying to communicate as much as possible a coherent vision about the future that we want that integrates adaptation and mitigation together into one story. And I really liked the phrase that you were using, Chris, around speaking to root causes and coming back to the need to end fossil fuel pollution as being essential whenever we're talking about anything that we think of as being adaptation, really making sure to come back to that. I'll also just say that I do think that I think there's a live question here that'll become more live over the next couple of years as the thing of like, you know, the kind of first they deny climate change is happening, then it's like we can't do anything about it, then it's deny that it's happening, say that we can't do anything about it. There's going to be a stage in that's like all we should do is adapt to the impacts. We shouldn't do any of the mitigation. And I do think that there's work to be done on crafting the most resilient message to that messaging coming out of particularly some of the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel industry aligned messengers in this country. So I think that what Chris is saying is absolutely right. And that I actually think is part of why it's wise for us as a climate movement to be looking to incorporate both adaptation and mitigation messaging together now and fusing those together. So there isn't to inoculate the public in many ways from an attempt to say we should just adapt, we shouldn't mitigate at all, which is present already in some places and is definitely coming.
Thank you. We're going to end the webinar soon, but I want to end with this question for all of you guys, is that what's the main lesson you learned from the work that you've done, from your campaign, Jamie, and from your writing and research, Chris and Louise? And what's one thing that you want to explore or do in your next action? We'll start with Louise.
I really felt that the segmentation research and the focus groups helped me understand and know the people that are in my life. I really feel like I feel just so much better about it all. So that's the one thing. But the other thing, it's always, for me, the next research question, if you will, and I'm really struggling with what I'm learning about our jump to affordability messaging, and how technologically optimistic we've been in our messaging, which is not seen as credible or believable by a lot of the people we're trying to speak to. There'll be more to come on that. We'll be doing a playbook on affordability in the new year. But I just want to kind of end what I'm trying to understand and learn now by saying, don't assume your messaging on affordability is working in the way that you think. That's what I'm, yeah.
Chris and Jamie, in 20 seconds.
Well, I'll end just by saying, in the same way that it is so heartening to have such a large group together here today, there was, through all the focus groups, an underlying, if vague, sense that we really do need to get cracking on this issue. Things break down around whether solutions are realistic, whether Canada can do anything much on its own, but it's not that people don't care.
Thank you. Jamie?
I'll say really briefly then, I think the biggest finding for us was just how open Canadians are to hearing from climate disaster survivors and the power and the empathy from that. And then I'll close as a bit of a piece then to say going forward, really echoing, Louise, what you're saying around a big question mark about how to talk about affordability and appreciation for Re.Climate eco-analytics in this entire community. I've learned actually a lot just from reading the chat over the last 15 minutes. I've hugely appreciated it, that this is a collective research project about how we best engage and talk to each other in this incredibly adaptive environment. And so big appreciation to all of you as we look to answer, I think, the really question now coming back to affordability of, if you listen to us, will life get better or will it get worse? We have work to do on every Canadian, doing what you were saying, Chris, being able to say, yes, I care about this, and if we live to our lives, we'll get better. But we'll get there in part because we're doing it together. Yeah.
Powerful. Thank you. Perfect ending. And thank you, Chris and Louise and Jamie. This was wonderful. Thank you for everyone who attended. Thank you for the energy that you always bring to our webinars. We really appreciate it. After the webinar, we'll be sending the recording with it, and along with it is the slide deck and the 2 resources that we promised: the playbook for how to build a social mandate for climate action in Canada, and a 4-page summary of the engageable 4 segments and what are their personas and behavior. If you were eager to get into the weeds of the research, we'll be also sharing a detailed technical report with all the findings and the methodology. And we hope that these all will be valuable tools in supporting your the work that you are doing, and the engagement or the advocacy or the research that you're involved in. We'll share a link to our follow-up survey, and we appreciate the feedback that we get from you. And if those of you who are not following us, please follow us on LinkedIn and sign up on our website. And all the links will be shared in the chat. And if you have questions, please let us know. Again, direct the questions to the email that will be in the chat. And thank you, and have a great day, everyone.